If you only know Orion from the DC animated universe, then you might think of him as Superman's ally, a soldier from New Genesis who steps in to the fight with Darkseid. But in the comics, he was so much more. The son who would destroy his father, the hero at the heart of Jack Kirby's Fourth World saga. But when the DC animated universe rolled out, he was pushed into the background, playing second fiddle to Superman. Before we get into why that happened, it's worth looking at his comic book origins to fully appreciate what Jack Kirby had in mind. Orion first appeared in The New Gods #1, published in 1970. This was the comic that fully explained the concept of the Fourth World. The old gods fought a bitter war that brought about their own destruction, and from the ashes rose 2 new planets. The first was New Genesis, idyllic, bountiful and lush. Its sister world, Apocalypse, was industrial, polluted and steeped in hate. Almost immediately, the 2 planets entered into a long and bitter war. The army of New Genesis was led by a man named Isaiah, whose beloved wife Avia was assassinated by the apocalyptian Steppenwolf and his nephew Darkseid. Torn apart by grief, Isaiah went on the attack and the 2 forces were evenly matched, with countless people being killed. When Isaiah eventually got his revenge on Steppenwolf, it brought him no peace. He realised that in fighting this war he had lost himself and was just as bad as his mortal enemies. While wandering the battlefield, he discarded his armour and weapons, vowing to discover a new path. He found the Source, as in the source of all creation, essentially God, and he took on the identity of Highfather. In his new role, he opted to make peace with Apocalypse and arranged for a treaty that saw his son exchanged for one of Darkseid's sons. Highfather handed over his newborn son, so young he hadn't officially been named yet, although Granny Goodness named him scot-free before she locked him away in her orphanage, while he received Darkseid's feral son, Orion. Orion had never met his father, and the rejection he felt curdled into rage. When he was sent through a boom tube to Highfather, his first instinct was to try to kill him with a hidden blade. But Highfather was determined to make their pact work. He may not have been the boy's biological father, but he would treat Orion as his own son. And that's really Orion in a nutshell, the ultimate clash of nature versus nurture. He was born on Apocalypse, son of the ultimate evil, but was shaped by Highfather and the gods of New Genesis. As Darkseid's son, he inherited both his father's immense strength and his distinctive face, although thankfully the Mother Box, a sentient computer linked to the Source, was able to soften his features. When Darkseid ventured to Earth to find the solution to the anti-life equation, a formula that would allow him to seize control of all living things, Orion was tasked with stopping him. On Earth, Orion foiled Darkseid's plans, taking up residence in Metropolis and going by the secret identity of Orion, the private investigator. He clashed with human followers of Darkseid like Intergang, as well as Apocalyptians like Mantis, the Deep Six, and his half-brother Kalibak. Darkseid, for his part, was actually quite fond of Orion. He was proud of the man he had grown up to become, despite being on opposite sides. Darkseid hadn't cared for Orion's mother Tigra. He had been forced to marry her by his own mother, and he had little interest in Orion when he was a boy. When he sent Kalibak to stop Orion, he stood by and watched his 2 sons battle to the death, eager to see who would come out on top. When his minion Destined interfered in the conflict, Darkseid was furious and killed him to ensure that it would be a fair contest. Ultimately, Orion won and decided to take the battle directly to Darkseid. It was at this point that DC cancelled the series, allegedly due to lower than expected sales, but there are reports that some unscrupulous retailers were taking copies of the more popular books directly from the printers and cutting DC out. Eventually, Kirby grew fed up with DC's treatment of him and he returned to Marvel. DC brought the New Gods back without Kirby's involvement and made some big changes, redesigning the characters and stripping away some of the themes of the book. Ultimately, these books were short-lived though. In 1984, DC Comics publisher Jeanette Kahn offered an olive branch to Kirby, asking him if he wanted to continue his New Gods saga, and he accepted. Kirby's new story followed up with Orion battling through the hordes of Apocalypse to defeat Darkseid and rescue his mother. However, it ended with Orion falling into Darkseid's trap, where he was gunned down. The story concluded in one of DC's first graphic novels called The Hunger Dogs, which saw Orion, healed by a Mother Box, finally defeat Darkseid, rescue his mother, and obliterate half of Apocalypse. Kirby had intended for Orion to kill Darkseid, but DC editors didn't want to remove a valuable character like Darkseid. As well as being a prominent threat in the comics, at the time he was the main villain of the latest version of the Super Friends cartoon, the Superpowers Team Galactic Guardians, which is a bit of a mouthful. It's important to note that their Darkseid was a pale imitation of the comic book version, though, more interested in snagging Wonder Woman than controlling the universe, and the whole plot around the pact between New Genesis and Apocalypse and Orion's destiny to one day defeat Darkseid was completely absent. So that brings us to the DC Animated Universe version of Orion, who first appeared in Superman the Animated Series episode Apocalypse Now, Part 1, which first aired in 1998. In this episode, Orion dramatically comes to Earth to warn Superman that Darkseid is coming. Broadly speaking, this version of Orion is the same as his comic book counterpart. He was Darkseid's son, but he had been traded as a baby rather than a young child. He never knew life on Apocalypse and had no desire to be reunited with his mother, that we knew of. As an aside, the way the pact was framed in this show, it didn't immediately make clear who Highfather's son was, as I learned from the comments on my Calabac video. About a dozen or so people told me that they were certain that Calabac was the son that had been swapped with Orion, hence why Darkseid despised him. Maybe it's because he and Highfather shared the same haircut and facial hair. But no, Mr. Miracle is the child of New Genesis that got handed over to Darkseid. Much to Darkseid's despair, Calabac is his flesh and blood. But I digress. Orion's inner struggle with his rage was dialed down, and the whole subplot about the mother box changing his face to be less beastly was completely removed. He didn't take up residence on Earth, nor did he adopt a civilian identity. While in the comics he had been the driving force pushing back against Darkseid's advance, here he was a messenger. He warned Superman about Darkseid's machinations and helped him destroy some apocalyptian weapons, but then went back to New Genesis to rally the troops. When he returned in Apocalypse Now, Part 2, he was the cavalry, leading the army of New Genesis to persuade Darkseid to leave Earth alone. You can really tell in this scene that he relished the idea of Darkseid resisting, but he didn't get to have his confrontation with Darkseid until much later. No, in the DCAU, Superman was the primary force fighting Darkseid. In essence, he replaced Orion. Superman was the one who defeated Calabac. He was the one who Darkseid admired in his own way and sought to corrupt. Darkseid even went as far as kidnapping Superman and brainwashing him into thinking that he was his son, all to lead an attack on Earth. That's not to say that Orion was insignificant though, but ultimately he took a backseat to Superman. This was perfectly demonstrated in the Justice League two-parter, Twilight, where Darkseid teamed up with Brainiac to capture Superman. Of course, Darkseid ended up betraying Brainiac and sicked him on New Genesis. Orion defied Highfather's orders to stay away from the conflict and challenged Darkseid. Unlike his comic book counterpart, Orion was defeated by Darkseid and almost killed. Superman was the true champion, defeating Darkseid and leaving him to die when Brainiac's base exploded. Thankfully, Batman's boom tube also dragged an unconscious Orion to safety. With the threat from Apocalypse neutralized, Orion became a member of the expanded Justice League in Justice League Unlimited, but to be honest, he didn't really have a major role. He can be seen among the forces defending Earth from Amazo in The Return, but he got wiped out with the rest of the League in an instant. His most notable appearance came in the episode Flash and Substance, a Flash-centric episode where Central City opens a new museum dedicated to the Flash, and he asks Batman and Orion to come with him to the grand opening. Orion is incredulous. He cannot believe that anyone would want to build a monument to a jester like the Flash, but Batman insists that he comes along to see why the Flash is so well respected. I'd argue that the most significant thing about this episode is the difference in approach that the three heroes have. The Flash is more light-hearted and jovial. He talks to his foes to defuse situations. By this point in the series, Batman has mellowed a bit. He observes and physically intervenes only if he needs to. Orion, meanwhile, is very quick to anger and communicates through his fists. He spends much of the episode in complete disbelief that the Flash is a successful hero and that people look up to him. He has no respect for the Flash or his methods. However, he would come to eat his words as the Flash saves the day. There are two scenes in this episode that are particularly relevant to Orion's character. In the first, he, Batman, and the Flash head to a known hangout for the Rogues to interrogate the Trickster. Trickster attempts to attack them with a nose-shaped gun that fires acidic snot at them. It's not a real challenge for them, but Orion responds by grabbing the Trickster by his collar, lifts him off the ground, and threatens his life. The Flash immediately intervenes, telling Orion to calm down. The Trickster is not well. He doesn't know what he's doing. All he needed was someone to talk to and to remind him to take his meds. And that's how the Flash gets the information they need. He even trusts the Trickster to turn himself in because he said he would. The second important scene is the actual fight with the rogues at the Flash Museum. Orion dives in without any real thought or strategy and gets incapacitated pretty quickly. As powerful as he is, there's not much he can do when he gets frozen solid by Captain Cold. By the episode's conclusion, when the Flash saves the day, Orion has a revelation. The Flash isn't a mere jester. He uses comedy to hide his warrior's pain in the same way that Orion uses his anger. When Darkseid was resurrected at the end of the series, Orion and the rest of the New Gods were nowhere to be seen, likely defending New Genesis from Darkseid's forces. It would have been great to have seen them, but Orion's presence likely would have taken the focus away from Superman, who, once again, was the main hero in this story. And that's broadly true of the animated Orion in general. Despite being a significant figure in the Fourth World saga, the DCAU version of Orion was always overshadowed by Superman. At the end of the day, Darkseid was presented as Superman's enemy in Superman the Animated Series. While Orion's connection to Darkseid was acknowledged, it was just a bit of trivia more than anything else. And when Darkseid defeated Orion, it was done to highlight his power and his villainy, and further show how capable Superman was. In the end, Orion's journey through the DC animated universe was not the one Jack Kirby imagined. In the comics, he was the destined champion, a son fated to overthrow his evil father, and a hero forged in rage who struggled to master his darker nature. In animation, those traits were acknowledged, but they were never the story. No, the story belonged to Superman. Orion was a supporting player, a source of exposition, and to be frank, diminished. He was a warrior whose greatest battles mostly occurred off-screen, and that's kind of sad. Maybe he will get the chance to show what he's truly made of in the upcoming Mr. Miracle animated series. But for now, all we have is a formidable hero who waits for his full story to be told. Okay, that's it for this week's essay. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, tell all your friends about me. You know how YouTube works. If you really enjoyed the video and have the means, please consider making use of the thanks button to send a buck or two my way, because every little helps. I offer channel memberships for $1.99 a month. This will get you early access to my weekly video essay, priority responses to your comments, members-only videos, custom emojis, and an icon on your profile indicating that you're one of my people. And special thanks to my channel members. Everyone who was a member at the time of this video's creation is listed on the screen right now. If you want to see your name amongst all these wonderful people, join the channel now. Next time, I'll be back on Monday to talk about a very touching episode of Batman the Animated Series that doesn't feature any costume supervillains. Instead, it's a very human story about poverty, dehumanization, and greed. I'm going to talk about Appointment in Crime Alley. And then next Friday, I'm kicking off my Spooky Month videos, where I'll be focusing on horror-themed characters and episodes. Up first is the doting wife of Kirk Langstrom, who would go on to become a casualty of her father's obsession. We're going to be talking about Francine Langstrom, the She-Bat. Hope to see you then.